Welcome to the executive summary of the Millennial Dilemma, a new report by News Cities on the steep challenges facing the American millennial generation, the largest in U.S. history with more than 75 million members entering middle age over the next decade, and how their lifestyle choices will shape the urban fabric for another generation at least. I'm Greg Lindsay, author of the report and director of applied research at News Cities. It's my pleasure this afternoon to take you through this executive summary of the report. This report is divided into several sections. First, I'm going to walk you through some brief trends on sort of how the millennial generation is dealing with the second financial crisis in their lifetime and how they're doing what they can to make the best of these terrible circumstances, especially given a pandemic. Then I'm going to walk you through snapshots of 5 cities that have proven to be millennial magnets, including Columbus, Ohio, Dallas-Fort Worth, Denver, Nashville, and Washington, D.C., followed by a section on market responses to their lifestyle trends, and finally a list of policy recommendations for the next U.S. presidential administration to basically provide the bailout that millennials so desperately need. But with that, let's get into some of the discussion. So the millennial generation, this should have been their peak earning and childbearing years, but it was not meant to be. As I allude to, the millennial generation has been dealt a particularly hard lot compared to the generations that preceded it. Here, in these Washington Post slides drawn from census data, you can see that the millennials are in fact one of the hardest hit generations here, with some of the lowest economic output, an actual decline in wealth through 2016 before the COVID recession. And here you can see that while millennium employment recovered after the last financial crisis more than a decade ago, their earnings never did. This is, as I said, this is a generation that is now experiencing the second financial crisis effectively of its lifetime. And while the K-shaped recovery has afforded wealthier millennials an opportunity to buy homes and move into adulthood, millions and tens of millions more have not been so lucky. And what this has led to, predictably, is an actual decline in the US birth rate. So millennials, again, a generation that is struggling financially, that is doing its best to basically move into the hallmarks of adulthood, is in fact choosing, as it has before, to push those goalposts into the indefinite future. Now, from an urban perspective, of course, one of the big questions is, will the millennials continue to be an urban generation with their stated preference for cities? Some research has shown, for example, that millennials are 21% more likely to purchase their first home closer to an urban core than the white picket fence suburbs of old. But one of the questions that has to be asked, given their financial circumstances, is, are millennials choosing to stay in cities, or are they effectively stuck there? What is, in fact, their actual preference? So this is something worth exploring because, the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, for example, has shown with its predictions that basically the number of childless households and effectively sort of single households will increase over time with the millennials because they're not actively replacing themselves and their Gen Z or younger brethren with children of their own. So, the need for, basically large single family homes in suburbia is in fact declining, creating new opportunities for cities to create more housing for a more proper match for millennials. So this is one of the questions we have. This has been, to date, to borrow a meme here, millennials, of course, have been more drawn to cities than suburbs. But the question is when they have the means, whenever that may be, will they actually follow in their boomer parents' footsteps? Now, part of this thesis was adopted by USC's Dowell Myers, who published in 2016 a report called Peak Millennial. His hypothesis was what we refer to as the bathtub theory, that while the faucet was continuing to put millennials into the tub was in fact not draining. He pointed to evidence showing that it was in fact the boomers and Gen Xers who were unable to basically get out of their underwater mortgages, thus freeing up the homes that millennials would have moved into. The entire pipeline of housing in the United States had ground to a halt, or I suppose was clogged, we should say. So therefore, yes, millennials were staying in cities, but staying longer than they might have otherwise. And Myers and his co-authors predicted that over time, as the pipeline ahead of them cleared and as millennials came onto their own, they too would move to more suburban single-family homes. And that, before the financial crisis, is exactly what had started to happen, that we had in fact seen peak millennial in cities. But then, of course, COVID happened. And as I referred to earlier, for millennials who are wealthy enough to be in the top part of the K-shaped recovery, and it's sort of dividing there, home sales are booming, of course, for millennials and Americans alike here, as they take advantage of historically low interest rates to basically file new mortgage applications, as you can see by this chart. We've also found that, that studies had already shown that millennials, of course, far be it from killing housing or killing car ownership, were turning out to drive at much the same rates as their boomer parents. And again, not necessarily something to be celebrated, but simply pointing out that much of the housing that millennials perhaps would have preferred to live in, walkable, near amenities, and we'll get into what the data shows on this, was in fact not being built fast enough. So the millennials were perhaps being forced to follow in their parents' footsteps, going out into suburbia. As you can see here, the question of what would millennials choose has been subsumed by the larger structural questions of what options do millennials actually have. And you can see this, that, the coastal metros of the United States that, had been where millennials are moving from are exactly the places where homeownership is the least affordable. This is a graph here by a firm called Unison, which is basically trying to sort of create market home equity to millennials. So it's a bit self-serving, but here you can see that, according to their calculations, it would take 40 years to save for a down payment on a medium home in San Francisco, 43 in Los Angeles, and 36 in New York City. So millennials who have been seen exiting these cities by the tens of thousands for Sunbelt metros are doing so because they are pursuing the option that makes the most sense to them, which led ultimately to my hypothesis here that millennials will move to large Sunbelt metros, will move to suburbs in these Sunbelt metros, and will try to retain as much of their urban life as they can. And this trend, of course, has only been accelerated by the COVID pandemic. Obviously, New York City being the epicenter of the US spread, triggered this whole incredibly ongoing discourse around, will COVID-19 spur a migration from dense cities? Will we see them flee these coastal metros? And the early results from New York City says yes, and they are leaving for exactly the places you might expect to see millennials go to. Large draws like Charlotte, Atlanta, Nashville, Dallas-Fort Worth, and Austin in particular, all places where millennials have chosen to for the relatively high quality of life, high job growth, and low cost of living. And this is being reflected, as we're seeing now, in all sorts of anecdotal data coming from real estate during the pandemic as well. Remote work, which will come up as well here, is also driving this dispersal as millennials basically try to retain their high-paying jobs in these coastal metros while arbitraging them for lower costs of living elsewhere. Zillow, Redfin's arch competitor, is a little less sanguine, but also seeing that, yes, searches are way up as the millennial generation accelerates the timeline that perhaps would have seen them leave these dense cities for larger homes in Sunbelt metros, is now all happening at once. Now, in years past, we've seen from survey data that millennials, in fact, as I mentioned, were different than their boomer parents, and to some extent, even than their Gen X brethren. They were more likely to prefer the kind of urban walkable amenities than their predecessors were. And then you can see this in survey data by the National Association of Realtors, for example, about its importance in deciding where to live, with their emphasis on walkable communities and sidewalks. This gets, of course, manifested in Walk Score, owned by Redfin as well. But you can see this, that, and this is interesting in light of the pandemic, of course, that they were more inclined to privilege outdoor space and amenities than they were necessarily shops and restaurants, the supposedly lifestyle bars and amenities that young people preferred. Now, of course, all of this changed the moment these millennials and their predecessors had children. And there you can see the resurgence in preferences for more classical single-family home, car-dependent suburbia. And of course, if you are a millennial, trying to reconcile your urban preferences with your new children has proven to be a bit mind-bending. Here you can see that, yes, that millennials would be willing to spend more to live in a walkable community while still having the advantages of larger homes when having children. And my favorite slide in this of all these realtors is showing, of course, that yes, millennials with kids in school are the most confused about what they want in life. And I would argue the reason they're the most confused is because the marketplace in particular has not provided the kind of housing types and neighborhoods and amenities that they would like to have. It's impossible to ask where the millennials are truly headed because we actually haven't built the product types and the communities that they would like to live in. This is, of course, a massive opportunity for any American city that is trying to attract or retain these talented young workers. And it's imperative for us to build these, of course, in a very equitable way. So we haven't, of course, and is one way of explaining why we haven't or what the urban growth patterns of the United States do look like. I've borrowed these slides from Issy Roman, former economist at Zillow, and now runs his own firm, Metro Insight. And here you can sort of see this is his stylized graphic of Los Angeles in particular, but also almost all American cities over the last 50 years. Pockets of high density construction in the downtowns, housing starts at the peripheries, and then a vast dormant interior of either wealthy NIMBYs refusing housing to be built or dilapidated neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods and communities of color that have been systematically underinvested in. So just to give you an example, here is Washington, D.C. in sort of the post-war era. Again, you can see huge growth over time in the district proper where millennials have flocked, and of course also in sort of the exurban periphery there of Maryland and Virginia. But again, huge sclerotic pockets of homes where very little has been built. Therefore, seeing the pattern replicated across the United States of millennials trying to cling to their urban core, bound by the centripetal forces of work and preferences until they are centrifugally flung to the periphery, where they then are forced to adopt a more car-dependent way of life. And this comes up in all the cities we'll look at. One of the questions we have is how do we create these missing middles, this missing product type that millennials would prefer to live in if given the chance? This would require taking those dormant suburban pockets and urbanizing them, infilling them with new homes and infilling them with new retail and other amenities. And a handful of cities have taken these steps. Portland, Oregon, during the pandemic, passed arguably the most progressive zoning code in the United States that would allow this missing middle housing to be built with multiple units on a lot, therefore allowing new families to move in and sort of, again, be drawn to these attractive neighborhoods. These are the kinds of policies we'll explore in the policy recommendations section to follow. But first, I want to walk you through a handful of snapshots of American cities that have proven to be the most attractive to millennials so far. The first here is Dallas-Fort Worth. Dallas is the only city, according to research by Marcus Most of the University of Waterloo, to have multiple millennial clusters, including one that's more than 30 miles beyond the urban core. It's exceptional in that regard. And it actually maps very closely to my experience of Dallas on the ground. So the center of Dallas in particular would arguably be Clyde Warren Park. This is one of America's most successful urban parks, built on top of a covered highway that links downtown Dallas, which, like Manhattan and other places, has seen a resurgence of families and people being drawn to it, and also Uptown, which has proven to be one of the most popular revitalized neighborhoods, again, a place of apartment rental towers and luxury amenities there. And Clyde Warren has become the connective tissue binding these neighborhoods together. I had the opportunity of chatting with Downtown Dallas Inc.'s Courtney Garrett, who in a bit of irony had to leave downtown Dallas and move to one of the classic streetcar suburbs on the other side of the Trinity River to find the housing types for her fraternal 7-year-old twins. She's currently working on a paper exploring about why developers are not building what might be called multifamily housing, 3- and 4-bedroom apartments that could accommodate families like hers. The answer is most likely, of course, that the market won't uphold it. So the question is are there subsidies or other policies that might be used to actually make that product type available? Because otherwise, millennials are moving out, again, to the urban periphery of Dallas. They're moving out to places, what used to be the edge, like Plano, where Legacy Town Center and other corporatized town centers are providing a bit of walkable urbanism in a sort of sea of auto-driven highways. But other places like, in Frisco, for example, which has invested heavily in its schools and design guidelines, developers like Craig Hall are transforming Hall Park, formerly a suburban office park, into a millennial-friendly walkable urban zone. This is a trend that will come up in the market responses section as well. Denver is another example of this. In Denver, some of the most popular millennial neighborhoods are the River North, the Rhino District, which again, full of craft breweries and the like. And it's here where Kyle Zeppelin and his father built Taxi, which is a really innovative multifamily rental apartment building, which, as Kyle told me when he interviewed me, or when I interviewed him, I should say, but yes, many of the multifamily apartments were being filled by childless millennials with roommates instead, who were drawn by its proximity to amenities, while those families were moving out to the fringes of Denver or moving into these places like slot homes. This is the local derivative of trying to basically build the maximum allowable apartment area on a lot, producing these ugly and now outlawed typologies. But many of the millennials that I met in Denver were being flung out to the periphery to places like Reunion, a master plan development in Commerce City out by Denver International Airport, where yes, where basically people were willing to drive until they qualify in exchange for larger homes there. And with remote work and of course with Zoom, I bet they're feeling quite happy about their choices at the particular moment, as of course, the need to commute to the CBD has been at least temporarily short-circuited by the pandemic. Of course, Denver was also the place, that pioneered basically mall redevelopment, turning dead malls into more urban pockets. Belmar in the suburb of Lakewood has become a very popular urban destination, referred to as the downtown of Lakewood, here seen during its popular Italian festival each year. And basically sort of a successful model for what suburban retrofit can look like, which is of course a hallmark of many of the millennial communities I'm looking at in trying to create these urbanized suburbs. Here in Alexandria, of course, in Arlington County on the edge of Washington, D.C., I forget the name of this particular mall now, which is being redeveloped by Howard Hughes Corporation, into a town center, landmark mall, I should say, which is now being redeveloped as a mixed-use live, work, play redevelopment. And this is a trend, again, seen across the United States. Crystal City, Virginia will undergo this itself in preparation to become Amazon HQ2. And, you know, an interesting development in Washington, D.C., which I hadn't seen elsewhere, according to survey data by the Urban Land Institute and Marianne Lachman, is that many of the millennials who had intended to leave have already left. That, you know, a higher percentage than normal of the millennials left inside the Beltway plan to stay. And this, of course, could have to do with the very high incomes recorded in these surveys, more than $140,000 in most cases per year. But, you know, it goes to show that perhaps the sorting process was already well underway. The other interesting thing about Washington, D.C. is that it really leads the way in creating suburban walkable urban places, as Christopher Lineberger of George Washington University defines them. This is the place that led the country in urbanizing the suburbs. And this map of walk-ups, as Lineberger calls them, in greater D.C., is also interesting with regards to sort of mapping employment patterns. This is maps by Emil Malizia of the University of North Carolina, showing where fast-growing startups choose to locate themselves in the years before the pandemic. And as you can see, it follows very closely the metro lines leading out into suburban and exurban Virginia and Maryland, where we're seeing more of these districts pop up all the time. Places like the Mosaic, or places like Pike and Rose, which is nearly a quarter mile from 6116 Executive Boulevard, arguably the deadest office building in America, which exemplifies in Frederick, Maryland, the kind of suburban office parks that millennials will no longer work in or no longer value when they can have these kinds of live-work development projects like Pike and Rose. And just to touch upon this quickly, in Columbus, Ohio, another one of our focus cities, you know, Dublin, Ohio, outside of Columbus, has become another exemplar of retrofitting suburbia into more walkable urban districts. Easton Town Center, which really pioneered the so-called lifestyle center concept in the early 2000s, is now undergoing a massive expansion, which will add more outdoor play areas, more amenities, its own bicycle sharing program, and so forth. It's part of a 20-year project by its developer, Jaromir Steiner, to create effectively millennial-friendly downtowns in the suburbanized pockets. Our final city of the focus cities is Nashville, which is perhaps the millennial city. At one point during the boom of the 2000s, it was drawing more than 100 people a day, particularly young people drawn by its universities. And like other successful millennial magnets, it has the combination, like Columbus, like Minneapolis, like Austin, it has the combination of a state capital, of a large university, in this case Vanderbilt, and a fast-growing back office and tech sector that provided all the ingredients and the kind of backstop to make it a safe and attractive destination for millennials. Like Denver, Nashville also spawned its own real estate typology, the tall skinnies that were being used to sort of gentrify areas of the neighborhood. But Nashville, more than most, is having a sort of battle of its soul about what kind of city it wants to be. In 2018, the city officials, led by the mayors Barry and David Briley, sort of advanced a transit referendum that would have spent billions of dollars on basically creating light rail and other systems to allow Nashville to accommodate its growing traffic. That referendum was defeated, along with Mayor Briley in the subsequent election, by a coalition of white suburban voters, black voters in the urban core, scared of gentrification, and dark money funded by the Koch brothers to basically defeat the referendum, leading Nashville to sort of, question itself: what kind of growth does it want to have, and what kind of city does it want to be? Will it follow the trend of coastal urban cities and eventually lead to the kind of sclerotic housing growth that will force millennials to go elsewhere, or will it build to accommodate them? That brings me to the fourth section, market responses, looking at some of the examples of what's happened here in American cities. First is, of course, the resurrection of the starter home. For years, the starter home sort of fell by the wayside as home builders focused on ever larger single-family homes, focusing on boomers and wealthy Xers. But we've seen a resurgence of late and sort of specialized product types moving to cater to them. One example is Lennar's next-gen concept, which basically folds an apartment into the house. This is pitched as sort of a granny flat apartment, or aimed at family members who can opt as caregivers, which we'll come back to momentarily in policy recommendations. But a lot of millennials, of course, were using it as Airbnb apartments, using it to actually help generate the funds to cover down payments. We've also seen home builders specialize in conceptual types, thinking about what is it millennials want when it comes to homes. Pardee, the home builder, designed these in Las Vegas for past iterations of the International Builders Show, thinking about indoor-outdoor lifestyles and basically designing homes that could basically be a new pipeline for millennials to move up to multifamily open plan homes, all of which, of course, is under question as now we prize Zoom stages in his and her Zoom rooms in our homes. The second solution going on to work is remote work as a solution for commuting. This, of course, ties back to this notion that yes, that that we are going to see millennials leave coastal cities for larger homes, or in the case of as Airbnb is marketing it, don't work from your home, work from any home. Perhaps more nomadic lifestyles out in the countryside as millennials pursue other options. Now, this, of course, again, ties very closely to income, because we've seen that the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to remote work, or yes, in that direction of correlation there. And so, yes, this is providing an option for millennials who have the means. But I also think this will also be a trend that will, again, continue to help urbanize the suburbs, because we've seen that remote work and collaborative workspaces that started in urban cores like WeWork are now spreading to the suburbs. Serendipity Labs was designed literally as a sort of co-working space for corporates in the suburbs. They're seeing some of their fastest growth in places like Columbus, which are, of course, millennial magnets. And we're seeing that remote work and co-working is bleeding into other forms, not just office space, but shopping malls in the case of San Francisco, in big box stores in the case of the suburbs of Boston, dedicated office depots in San Jose, California. And so it's not hard to imagine that, again, as millennials move to suburbs and try to basically carry their urban lifestyles with them, we will see product types start to respond to that as work flows out of urban cores and offices into all sorts of product types. Third, co-living, co-housing, and childcare as a service. Co-living, of course, was spawned out of the co-working movement. WeWork gave birth to WeLive, which is a bit of a stall. But we've seen other providers like Common spawn new product types designed with millennials in mind. One of which is Kin, which we could describe as, again, childcare as a service, a co-living type with buildings that will be expressly designed for families with small bedrooms for children, that's offering its own internalized, basically apps to help pair parents with caregivers, providing amenities like playrooms on each floor, and literally designing a home product type aimed at parents of children under the age of 7. This is a very interesting response, particularly for parents in dense urban cores, for which childcare is such an incredible expense. So how can you internalize those into the cost of living, as the question Kin is asking itself? At the opposite end of the political spectrum, perhaps, and designed in Europe, is cohousing, which is the idea of groups of homeowners or parents, I guess we should specialize here, in coming together and designing their own housing types. Pioneered in Berlin and seen here in Barcelona, this is the idea of basically sort of crowdfunding your own home and designing to your own specifications. So perhaps we should import into the United States more co-housing projects with parents in mind, creating the new kinds of housing types that we need for millennial families and choosing to have the proper mix of public and private that they desire. But more likely, we're going to see the resurgence in the short term of the companies that want you to rent forever. And these are the Wall Street-backed various firms like Invitation Homes, American Homes for Rent, that spawned after the last financial crisis and acquired single-family homes out of foreclosure by the tens of thousands. Reporting by the Wall Street Journal's and underwater author Ryan December, who's focused on a recent episode of our big Rethink series, has dug into how Wall Street created these firms to just basically turn single-family homes into a rental asset class, and in doing so took huge amounts of housing inventory off the market that millennials would have purchased as their starter homes. So when we talk about the fact that millennials will likely have a lower share of homeownership than past generations, we need to take this into account, the fact that much of the housing they would have purchased, they are now going to rent instead, which of course has very big downstream implications for wealth accumulation and purchasing their second homes or third homes further down the line. And the COVID pandemic has blown new wind into the sales of these companies. Blackstone, which had exited its investment in Invitation Homes with a $7 billion profit, is now back in the game with an investment in a new company called Tricon. So we should keep an eye on these companies as they continue to basically turn housing into an asset class versus something they use to build wealth. Tied to this, of course, is the rise of other players as they attempt to basically market millennials with home equity as a service. So Airbnb, of course, was first with this, partnering with a few developers to create new apartment rentals and owned buildings alike, where you would basically pay for your part of your home ownership by putting your home on Airbnb as part of the design. Nido, their first building was in Nashville. The second one was in Orlando, literally sort of building Airbnb into the business model in this case. We've seen others like Landing emerge, which is part of the sort of nomad concept of invest in a membership and then rent in different buildings in a portfolio across the country. And Opendoor is perhaps the most successful example. They filed for an IPO. They're the ones who perfected the iBuyer model, where literally sell your home, get a quote to sell your home for 90 cents on the dollar in in moments using their algorithms, and then basically flipping those around, creating new liquidity for home ownership, and again, encouraging millennials to see their homes as an asset class. A number of other startups are partnering to basically offer millennials chunks of equity instead of debt to help them make that essential first purchase as a stair step to home equity. And I think we'll continue to see these startups pile into here as they realize that millennials are growing increasingly desperate to get into that first rung to home ownership. Homes in the cloud refers to some of the technology companies that are moving into making the most of small spaces in an attempt to basically, if millennials who are choosing to stay in high cost metros, how can they maximize the usage of that? So this is an early demo of Ori systems designed at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Media Lab, MIT Media Lab. There you can sort of see controlling lights and roboticized furniture to basically maximize the most of space. Bumblebee Spaces is another startup that literally puts your belongings in the cloud, and the cloud is storage areas above your head on your ceiling. We're going to see more and more, I think, Baroque companies like this that are attempting to sort of maximize what you do with your living space. Going further in scale, building the post-car suburb, we're seeing developers start to create not just new housing types, but also entirely new communities designed around the values that millennials hold. One of the ones I'm watching is Cul-de-sac, which is a new project in Tempe, Arizona, near Arizona State University, which is going to be more than 1,000 rental apartments with almost no parking on site because that has been repurposed to offer the kind of amenities that millennials want. In this case, it's food trucks. In the future, we might imagine perhaps it's on-site communal schools and so forth here as millennials choose to prize these different amenities over a classic parking space. And then finally, at the maximum size of the scale, and I'll show this to you with a little bit of sound in a moment, is thinking about the Metroburbs. This is Bell Labs, the massive Aero Saarinen 2 million square foot campus designed out in Holmdel, New Jersey, that's now being retrofitted into Bell Works, which is going to become a live, work, play development styled by its developers as a Metroburb, basically a pocket of urbanity out in the suburbs of Jersey that will increasingly cater to millennials who will no longer want to travel to dense Manhattan cores, who can remote work from home as they needed, and then actually commute to these kinds of offices and live, work, play spaces going forward. There are enough dead malls and dead corporate campuses around the country that the developer of this is specializing in just acquiring AT&T dead campuses, the second one's outside Chicago, to convert them into more Bellworks. Moving on to policy recommendations. This is our final section. Here I want to talk a bit about what we have in mind for the next administration. So first is expand and protect housing supply. The millennial dilemma is a housing dilemma. They're unable to afford the housing typologies that exist in coastal metros that they would prefer to live in. They're moving to Sunbelt metros and finding housing types they can afford but don't want to necessarily live in, and trying to find that sweet spot is one of our major projects here. So first, of course, I would advise cities and advise the administration to protect housing supply. We've seen eviction moratoriums in place. We've seen cities like New York and others explore rent control, which of course is very politically fraught. Many economists object to it on the grounds that it would prevent developers from adding to housing supply. But there's, of course, another left-wing argument as well that is essential to keeping people in cities in the short term while expanding housing capacity. I think cities and the administration need to adopt all available measures, including things like inclusionary zoning as done in New York, but also, look at a re-examination of public housing in the United States, as various city officials in San Francisco and state officials in Maryland have done, and also all sorts of other incentives to encourage the market to increase its supply of affordable housing and typologies that millennials would like. Some of those have not been designed. Dallas, for example, as I mentioned earlier, is working with its real estate community, trying to understand how could they add those product types. But this is a major project going forward. And it goes hand in hand with the second part, which is legalizing multifamily zoning. As I alluded to earlier with Portland, part of this challenge will be adding density into these dormant suburbs, making attractive places more recipient to new housing types. This is, of course, a massive ongoing political battle in the United States, but we've seen, again, states like Maryland, like Virginia, like Nebraska flirt with it. We've seen the state of Oregon pass it. We've seen cities like Portland and Minneapolis pass it. We have opportunities here to think about how we can sort of expand housing in place. And interestingly enough, Minneapolis first expanded it and Portland followed suit on the grounds that it's good for social justice, that single-family housing zoning was done as an overt tool of discrimination against communities of color. And so we need to adopt this on the grounds of racial justice as well. Third, again, going hand in hand with that is eliminate parking minimums. We've seen, and various studies have proven that, America's auto culture is self-perpetuating due to various incentives and legalities, parking minimums is one of those, basically requiring developers to add parking spaces, which add to the costs of apartments. If we could strip out those costs and allowing developers to help rationalize those parking costs and offer other amenities to residents, like Cul-de-sac is doing in Tempe, we have an opportunity to rethink our built urban form and provide those missing types for millennials. Fourth, reinvest in public transit. It goes hand in hand with this, that if we're going to basically try to phase out cars or offer alternatives, we need to invest heavily in public transit, which is in dire straits in the United States. We've seen ridership declines of more than 50% during the pandemic. And cities like New York City are in desperate need of federal funding. It should be a top priority for the next administration, if Congress is unable to pass stimulus, to fast track a transportation bill that will provide billions of dollars to support these systems until they're able to get back up on their feet. Fifth, provide universal childcare. This is something that was proposed by Senator Elizabeth Warren during her presidential run. We've seen that during the pandemic in particular, that nearly half the childcare spots for preschool-age children in the United States are in danger of closing. If there's one thing we can do to help parents, it's to provide subsidized and universal free daycare to basically allow them to work or create the space after the pandemic in which they can sort of get back up on their feet. And so I think, there's a number of proposals for this. Senator Warren had one. There's several in Congress in terms of offering block grants to cities to provide these programs, as New York did with universal pre-K, about whether we should offer this as tax credits to parents and so forth. We can skin the cat any number of ways, but it's incumbent to think about how we can basically subsidize parents as one of the fastest ways of supporting young millennials. Six, provide student debt relief. While we're at it here, student debt, of course, comprises $1.5 trillion of debt, most of which is held by millennials. No less than an organization, the National Association of Realtors, is in favor of debt forgiveness on the grounds that that $1.5 trillion and its interest could be more productively spent in buying housing. And I agree. Senator Warren, during her campaign, proposed using executive orders to basically eliminate 90% of that debt with a stroke of a pen. And it's something the next administration should consider as a way of freeing up and moving that interest off the government books into the more productive areas of the private sector. Seven, reimagine parks as urban infrastructure. America's had a bit of an urban park renaissance, investing in, of course, the wealthy neighborhoods adjacent to urban centers. We need to see more of that in lower income communities. And we also need to see parks thought of as armatures for adding more amenities to them, whether that is thinking about outdoor play spaces, whether thinking about places for childcare and other amenities. But how can we use them as not only as the lungs of our cities, but as the places of the new public space and a new place of reimagine them as offering new services. And then finally, how to assist and promote urban schools. I don't have enough time to go into how we should reform the American education system, but it's one thing to basically sort of see how the wealthy are trying to basically disconnect from public schools. First, of course, it was moving to the suburbs classically where good schools lie. Then it was looking at charters and other forms of private schools. And now, of course, we see families investing in pod schools and private education in backyards. It's imperative for cities, first off, to think about how to make the case to show to parents that urban school education has improved markedly in recent decades, as seen in test scores. And second, make the case that yes, just because you have a child, what's best for your child is not to move them out to a suburb with arguably a better school, according to various test scores. It's to keep them in these urban places and embed them in these communities. And then finally, and a much longer term project is to, of course, rethink how America funds its schools, moving beyond necessarily property taxes. So with that, it's been my pleasure to walk you through this executive summary of the millennial dilemma. Obviously, as you can see, if there's one group in the United States that needs a bailout, it's the millennials. Having suffered financial crises, entering their peak earning years, it's imperative not only for them and not only for parents as part of them, but also for America at large to think about how we can invest in this generation and their earning potential to basically help keep America going post-pandemic and in the years to come. So with that, it's been a pleasure walking you through, and thank you so much for watching. I hope you read the report.